The first thing I'd like to do is start with an overview of the class. So on your handout, if you have one, there are going to be some book recommendations. A couple of my absolute favorites that are on there, all of Michael Moore's books. I'm one of his students. I absolutely love his very knowledgeable writing and also his amazing sense of humor. So that's one that he has several, but depending on where you are in the country, they're all kind of in the West, but those are really excellent. The other one that I really love and is probably my very favorite book, honestly, of all time is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. So those are just a couple suggestions, but there's a lot on the list. So you can look at those. We're going to be talking about harvesting equipment. So, what are some tools that you can use for harvesting and wildcrafting herbs? You can use these in your garden or out in the wild. Some facts and statistics about kind of the where we are with medicinal plants and plants in general around the planet. Things to think about before we would wildcraft a plant, tuning into the plant to prepare for the possibility of wildcrafting. Next, we have how to wildcraft and how to do that ethically. Reciprocity, so how we can give back to the land and the medicinal plants and the ecosystem around us, the land around us. Where to wildcraft and also where not to wildcraft. And some of those are for our own health and wellness issues. Plants we might choose to wildcraft and plants we might choose not to wildcraft. And then what you can do to be a good steward of the land. So first, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement, and this is for where I am in Missoula, Montana. So Missoula is the traditional territory of several Native peoples, including the Salish, the Pend Oreille, and the Kootenai tribes. And I would like to offer my thanks to those people for being such amazing stewards of this beautiful and really precious land that I call home and have the grace and opportunity to live here. All right, so we're going to get in first to harvesting equipment. This is a student's, when we were out wildcrafting, a student's bag that I took a picture of that I just thought was a very sweet little, wildcrafting kit that she was carrying. So along with the regular things that you might use if you're out on a hike, such as like sunscreen, water, day pack, those kind of things that we're going to use to take care of ourselves as we're out in the wild. We might also want some things that are specific to working with medicinal plants. And the first one is documentation. So these could be things like your phone that you might take pictures of these plants, which I think can be extremely useful. A journal is always something really nice to have with us. And that's the kind of thing that I'll often document, like where I am, the location, but also what's going on around that area. So what are the other medicinal plants that are in the area? What are the other living things that are in the area? Possibly what kind of weather? Was it an early spring? Was it a late spring? Was it a particularly cold or warm winter? What are the current conditions, right? Because all of those things can tell me something about if I wanted to return to this spot, around what time might I do that? Might I want to try a little earlier next year if it's, say, a little bit of an earlier spring than it was the year before, etc. We can also bring pens and pencils, colored pencils, those kinds of things. And being out in the wilderness with medicinal plants or any plants is a wonderful way to actually drawing them. So doing a botanical drawing is a wonderful way to get to know a plant deeper without harvesting, right? So I find pictures do that as well, but drawing a plant, and it doesn't matter what the drawing looks like. It doesn't have to be a beautiful drawing. It's more about looking closely, observing closely, which I think can be extremely valuable way to get to know a plant better. Okay, you might also bring a big book for pressing or a plant press if you would like to press a specimen to have for later. And sometimes we might want a permit, and that would be depending on what kind of land we were on. So, say we were on Forest Service land or something like that. And we can talk a little bit more about that as well. The next thing is we might want a plant ID book. These can be really helpful, like a field guide or a dichotomous key, a loop, and that's like kind of like a magnifying glass specific for plants. So they're really tiny, that you can look really closely at a plant, right? And sometimes even a razor blade or a knife. So we can dissect like a flower and look inside or a seed. So those can be really helpful. And plant identification is extremely important for harvesting. We really want to make sure we're harvesting the right plant. There are poisonous plants out there, and that can be very dangerous. Or we don't want to kill plants or take plants that we aren't going to use that we might mistake for some other plant. So identification is extremely important. We might also want some tools, and those are really gardening tools, right? So we can have a garden trowel, we can have a nurseryman's shovel, and that is a long, thin shovel that goes very deep, but doesn't take up a lot of space. And I really like those because they don't disturb the ground as much, right? They won't disturb other plants as much. We can have snips, garden snips. I really like Felcos because they are you can take them apart, you can replace parts. They're very durable and they're really good on your hands. And so they're just a high quality tool. If you're going to be doing a lot of pruning or, gardening work or wildcrafting, those are really worth the investment to get something that's going to last and be, better on your hand. We might also have big loppers. We might even have a tamping bar. And this is something that people will use for like removing big rocks and things like that. So it's a big, heavy, long bar that you can actually carry like over your neck and shoulders and push down hard into the ground and go around a plant if you want to get a root out. And it disturbs the soil very little, which is really lovely. One of the things when we're wildcrafting is that we want to disturb the environment the least amount that we can. So choosing the correct tool for the job is really, really important. We also, if we're going to be making medicine out in the field, or even cleaning our, say, roots or plants that we got in the field, we might want some things for field prep. So this is especially important, say, if you're camping overnight or something like that. You might bring a 5-gallon bucket, a plastic brush. Sometimes a little tiny brush like a toothbrush can work really well, or maybe even a sponge. We might want like a cloth grocery bag, and I really like those, or I'll use a basket like this with either one or two handles I can put over my arm, but like a bag to put the herbs in as we're walking and wildcrafting, or even in the garden. I love to use my baskets for that. Okay. And then the last is, I'm sorry, there's two more processing. So things that we might want to, and again, this is if we're going to be out in the field making medicine or processing those plants. We might want a cutting board or a knife. We might want ingredients, including alcohol if we're making a tincture, or vegetable glycerin, or some kind of a fixed oil like olive oil. Those are all really helpful. We're going to want labels. We're going to want jars. We're going to want a pen to make sure we write down what we gathered, the name of the plant, the date that we gathered it, and what's in there. Is it alcohol or oil or whatever it is? A scale is also really, really helpful. And there are a few things that I really like and recommend with scales. One is you want something that has a battery, right? Because if you're going to be out in the wild, you're not going to be able to plug it in. The other is you want something that can tear. And what that means is that you can take off the weight of the jar or the bag or the container so that you just know the weight of the herbs inside. That is a really useful tool. I like scales that weigh up to about 10 pounds of material. And that's especially helpful if you're making larger batches or if you're using it for other things like making body care products or soap or things like that. Okay, so that's the scale, nice and portable. You might want string or rubber bands if you want to hang up and dry your herbs as well. And sometimes I'd hang those from my, I don't know what those are called, those little handheld things by the windows of the car. That's really helpful, especially in the back, so you can still see. And then the last thing you might want is a cooler with ice in it. And if it's a really hot day, and even if I'm just wildcrafting and I'm going to go back home, but it might be a few hours, I will have a cooler and I'll take my herbs and to keep them really fresh, I will put them in a plastic bag in the cooler so that I know they're going to stay nice and fresh until I can get them home and process them. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about some facts and statistics. And this is actually, these statistics are from a study from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, London, and that's spelled Kew. This was done in 2016, so it was a little while ago, but I know of no other study that was this comprehensive. And so that's why I still go back to this study, even though I feel like it's a little dated. It really is the most comprehensive one that I know of. So, a large team of researchers reviewed published literature from all around the world, and they scrutinized global databases and they synthesized new databases. So, they went to quite a bit of effort to compile this information. And you can actually look this study up online. So if you want to know more about the research that they did and the results, their findings, you can look that up online and just do a Google search for this. But what they found was about 21% or 1 in 5 of global plant species are threatened with extinction, according to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List criteria. I imagine that's even more now, but that 20% is, to me, a very scary and very serious number. What they found as some of the very major threats for this include land use. So, and this is largely due to population growth, right? So, habitat destruction and overharvesting of plants as humans clear land for their own use, right? So that can be housing or that can be agriculture or things like that. Along with that also comes over harvesting, right? So over 30,000 species in a fragile position could become threatened if they're over harvested. And so we need to think not just about the plants in general, but about very specific species as well, that some species might be more rare or more fragile in their environment. Most of the biologically diverse countries, in other words, the countries that have the most genetic diversity, the most diverse ecosystems, and those kinds of things, are developing countries, and they often have little funds for research. So, where we most kind of need that information, we actually have the least information available. The least amount of studies have been done in these countries. Um, invasive plants are also a major issue for land use, and that's because as humans go from place to place, they often bring either intentionally or unintentionally plants with them, right? And oftentimes those plants are can be invasive to new areas where they're not native. So the second is climate change. And this is often the warming of different environments around the world. So 10 out of 14 of the world's biomes have seen a decrease in vegetation productivity between the year 2000 and 2013. And that is a massive decrease. So in the past in the past 3 decades from when they did this research, so about at this point over around 10 years ago, um, Changes in the climate have been happening at a scale not seen in the last 850,000 years. So, very, very rapid changes. And like I said, so even now, this information is outdated. And then the third major threat is pests and disease. And this can be viral, fungal, bacterial, or insects or others, right? So plants we know are, well, I don't know if we know, we do know this, but I'm going to say it because I'm not sure everyone knows this, is that just like we're dependent on our food for our health and well-being, plants are dependent on the soil for their health and well-being. So if we think about industrial agricultural practices that vastly deplete the soil and can destroy the mycorrhiza of the soil almost completely, what we have is plants growing in very poor conditions for their own health and well-being, right? And then we add in diseases that normally a plant could fight off, but if it's already unwell, then it's less likely to be able to do that. Just like us as humans are less likely to be able to have a robust immune system if we don't have the nutrients that we need or if we're already in poor health. So that microflora of the soil, including bacteria and mycorrhiza, are extremely important for helping with disease and increasing nutrients. Monocrops are a huge problem in this way, right? They really deplete the soil and also herbicides and pesticides. Okay, so there is good news. So in this study as well, in the Q study, they found 2,034 new species that they had never seen before. And that's really exciting, right? In Brazil, they found a new insect-eating plant, a Drosera magnifica is its name. And this species grows to an incredible size of 1.5 meters. I mean, that's huge. How they didn't find it before, I don't know, but isn't that amazing? And that's in the sundew family. So actually a very fragile plant family. And then awareness about the threat to plants is also continuing to rise. And part of it is people who take classes like this, right? Who get interested in plants in one way or another, and then understand more about how important their health and the health of the entire ecosystem is that surrounds them. And there are so many things that we can do to support that. So we'll be talking about that as well. So, some things to think about first as we're getting started with this concept of wildcrafting and what we and how we might want to go about it, right? Is that all plants have a value in and of themselves. Every single plant on this planet evolved over millions of years, just like every other species on the planet, right? And has grown into its unique species over an incredible amount of time. The other part of that is that every single living being on the planet has its own unique experience. And although I often will wonder, like, I wonder what it's like to be a plant or a tree, and how I might feel living my life that way, right? What my experience might be. And although I think it's extremely different from ours, they are still alive. And the more and more research that we're doing actually finds them to be sentient beings, right? And so this to me is deeply beautiful and something to be really, really thought about and considered as we think about wildcrafting plants, right? They aren't here for our use. They are here for their own life, for their own purpose. They are not in service to human beings, although many plants very generously work with us, right? And can aid us. That's not why they're here. They're here for their own life and their own experience. And I think that's a really important thought to start out with as we think about wildcrafting or harvesting plants. The other thing is that every plant is part of a larger community. every plant is part of an ecosystem and interacts with other plants, with other living species, with insects, with animals, with the soil, with the mycorrhiza, right? And so there's this incredibly beautiful and complicated and rich and diverse connection that every plant has to its surroundings. And I think that's also really amazing. The preservation of biodiversity on this planet is currently, in my opinion, the absolute responsibility of human beings. And the reason for that is because we're the ones that are creating all of these problems. No other species on the planet is having the impact that human beings are having on the environment, on the climate, right? And so I do feel very strongly that it is our responsibility to make decisions that are beneficial to our brethren, to the web of life on this planet and to the planet itself. So part of that can be teaching children, just like we teach children. And if you have children, you know this, or maybe you've seen this. We have dogs and cats. And when my children were little, we taught them this is how you interact with an animal. This is how you do it respectfully. This is how you make sure you're not hurting them. This is how you approach, right? With your hand out, let them smell and touch softly and those types of things. Over and over again, I see children treating plants in ways that is disrespectful. And I feel like it is a natural, I'm not blaming children for that, honestly, because naturally they want to like grasp and reach out and they may not know how to, they learn how to be respectful with that, just like with animals. So can we teach our children that plants are living beings, that they too have feelings and an experience of being alive? And how can we treat them with respect? How can we touch them with respect? How can we interact with them in a way that is kind? Okay, so questions to ask before deciding to wildcraft. Are there indigenous peoples in this area? And how are they using this land? Right? So there may be indigenous people that are foraging on that land. And if that's the case, it may not be appropriate for me or someone else to forage on that same place, right? Do you have permission to gather? Do you need it? Right? So a lot of the foraging that I do is on private land. And honestly, what I've found is that when I reached out around the area and I reached out on Facebook a few years ago, and I just said, is there anyone who's interested in who has land who would be okay with me and students, so take students to private land and could we come and learn about what's on your land and respectfully harvest some plants? And the people that reached out and said yes, I met with them. I went to their land. I told them about what we would do. And I said, what's here that you would like us to not touch? And what's here that you feel comfortable with? And then I said, would you like to join us? And so that you can learn more about your land as well, right? So that's a really fun way to do that. The other thing is public lands, right? And so I have also worked with our city parks, and we used to take students to wildcraft in Greeno Park, which is a beautiful wild park here. And we worked with the city with that. So we said, can we harvest some of the invasive medicinals here so that we get rid of them and we'll leave the natives? And they were like, yeah, absolutely, sure. So we did that for some years, and then they started spraying, and we stopped doing that then. But so you might be able to work with your city or your county to do something like that. Or you might go to the Forest Service. And I also have worked with the Forest Service around this area. And funny enough, like when I did ask them, they were like, now you're going to do what? You want to do what? And they had no idea what I was talking about. And I had to be quite persistent actually in getting back to them over and over again to really get an answer. And what they ended up saying to me, and I want to say it could be different from different, Forest Service forests, national forests. So you can check with yours that's near you. But what mine said was like, you don't need a permit for the type of foraging or wildcrafting that you're doing. It's not commercial. And I said, well, I do, students, I bring students and they do pay us for that. And he said, well, how much are you taking? And I said, oh, maybe like a little jar for each person. And he said, oh, yeah, no, you don't need a permit for that. And so we go to the Forest Service land, and we have asked, and the answer was no, you don't need a permit for that Forest Service land, right? So check with yours. But there's also Fish and Wildlife or BLM land. And you do want to watch for spraying because all of those folks can spray, and that's all public record. So you can call and say, have you sprayed and where have you sprayed and what have you sprayed? And it's public record. So they should be able to tell you that. And we all, as citizens, have access to that knowledge or should. So we can make sure that we're harvesting in places that haven't been sprayed as well. Do you have correct identification? I mentioned this before, but this is extremely important. And so that means maybe you ID the plant yourself, which takes some skill, or maybe you go on an herb walk with an herbalist in your area, um, or maybe you go with a foraging group or something like that. But be very, very careful. There are very poisonous plants around the United States, plants that will kill you if you ingest them. And so, we have hemlock and water hemlock, poison hemlock and water hemlock. Here in Missoula, here in Montana, and those are two of the most poisonous plants in North America. So there are poisonous plants everywhere, and we really, really need to be careful about that. Okay. Are there rare, threatened, or endangered species in the area? And that can be plants, those can be animals, those can be insects. So that's really important to know too, because if there's an endangered animal or insect and they have a relationship with the plant that you're working with or that you want to harvest, or if the plant itself may be at risk, those are really important things to know. And those would be instances where I would not harvest that plant, right? Because there are things that are more important than whether I get to gather an herb or not. More questions to ask. Are you in a fragile ecosystem? So this can be something like a riverbank or a wetland or the desert. This is an aside, but something that really kind of breaks my heart is those commercials that we have a lot where you see those trucks or cars or whatever going off-road and driving across like the desert or whatever and destroying that fragile, fragile ecosystem. It is just, to me, like why they encourage that like that is just so irresponsible, in my opinion. So, anyway, that's an aside. But these fragile ecosystems that we have, we need to be really thoughtful about how we interact with them, right? Because we don't want to disturb. And my goal every time I go out into nature, and especially if I'm wildcrafting, is to be able to leave that area and turn around and look back. And it looks like I haven't even been there, right? So if I'm eroding banks or I'm leaving big footprints in, fragile soil or things like that, that to me is not okay. It's too much of an impact, right? So there may be ecosystems we need to either be very careful how we traverse them or interact with them, or there may be ecosystems where we're like, I'm not going in there because it is too fragile, right? How does the plant propagate and how often? This is also really important. So some plants, we have annuals. They have a lifespan of a single season and will seed during that time and make babies, and that's it. That's their life. We have biennials that do that over a span of 2 years. We have perennials and they can be short-lived perennials that maybe live a few years, or they can be long-lived perennials. And some of our trees can live literally thousands of years, right? So the lifespan of plants is vastly different depending on the species. So that's the first thing to note, right? Then the next thing to note is how do they reproduce? right? Do they need a special insect? Are they wind pollinated? Is it easy for them to reproduce? Do they make a lot of seeds or do they just make a few seeds? And how often do they do that? I want to give an example of Trillium. And Trillium is a plant that grows around here. It's native to this area. And it lives in, it's also called birthroot. And it lives in the deep, dark forest. So it loves like old growth forest, right? Like not newly cut and trees just growing up, or not like after a burn. It needs a lot of shade and a lot of rich soil. And the Trillium is a little tiny, and it's in the lily family. And it has every year, it puts up a single stalk that has three leaves and one flower. And that one flower and that one stalk is its source of survival, right? And also its source of reproduction. And so Trillium, on average, takes around 17 to 20 years to first flower. Imagine that. That little tiny, it dies back to the ground every year, comes up new every year. It doesn't even start producing seeds for 17 to 20 years, that little plant. And if we're traipsing through the forest and we break that stem, that little bulb, that little plant that grows from a bulb, just like a tulip kind of, right? Now has no way to feed itself for the rest of the year. And if it's young and it doesn't have a lot of resources, that plant will probably die. If it has enough of a bulb that it can survive that kind of devastation for that entire year, next year when it comes back, it's going to be weak, it's going to be more fragile, and less likely to survive. But hopefully it will. If it's able to do that for 17 to 20 years, it can produce its first flower and go to seed for the first time to actually propagate. So this little plant is medicinal, and I talk about it because it is medicinal. It's a plant that I've never harvested, and I never will harvest this plant. And that's because of the life cycle that it has. And it's also one that if I'm in the forest, if I'm in the deep forest and there's Trillium, I am so careful not to break a single stem. So Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about this like walking like a deer, she calls it, which I love. And that's basically, I look at the ground and every step I take when I am off a path, when I'm not walking on a trail, I am looking where I put my feet and making sure that I am not harming. I try not to harm anyone, but that I'm stepping in the places where I'm making the very least impact that I can. And I'm watching out very carefully for those plants that are fragile, such as Trillium. Okay, so that's a little story that is a good example. So what is the plant's life cycle? How long does it take the plant to sprout, to reach maturity, to flower, to go to seed? How old is the plant? And what are the populations of that plant? And we can think locally. So like when I do a lot of hiking, I love to get out in the woods around here. So I'm always looking at the plants and thinking like, oh, look at that population of the, Oregon grape or the arnica or the trillium or whatever it is, and just kind of noting like, oh, there's a lot. There's a lot there. Oh, there's less this year than there was last year. Or it looks like it's having a harder time. Or it looks really abundant and very, very happy this year, right? What are the populations nationally? And what are the populations around the world? One of the reasons that I love being a Western herbalist is because it's so important to me to be able to assess when I can the plants that I'm using. And the closer I am to them, so the more local those plants are, or bioregional, we could call it, the more I'm actually able to assess and say, like, yeah, I feel good about harvesting this plant because truly there's a lot of it around this area. Or, I'm going to hold off this year because the population this year seems really stressed. There's a drought or whatever it is, right? So if I'm getting herbs from across the globe, I have no idea what the population looks like, where those plants have been gathered, if if they've been sprayed by pesticides or I don't know, right? And so I love being able to assess the populations, but also have that personal relationship that wildcrafting a plant or growing it in our gardens gives us. This is one of our students harvesting hawthorn flowers and leaves. More questions that we can ask. Is the stand healthy? So sometimes hawthorn, the image that we just saw, sometimes this gets like a fungal growth. And this plant right here looks very, very healthy and well. And then the next year it can have a fungus that grows on it. And it looks like rust colored, like orangish, yellowish blotches that show up on the leaves. And if I saw that in this plant in a year, I wouldn't harvest those leaves because they're not healthy, right? I don't want to make medicine out of that. So, and it can happen every other year that occurs on hawthorn around these parts. So is the stand healthy, right? How heavily in demand is the plant? And not just by us, but by the ecosystem as well. For instance, I think about berries with birds and bears and wild animals, right? And I think about if I'm out gathering huckleberries, for instance, and there's a huge demand in Montana for wild-crafted huckleberries, and some people will commercially harvest it in quite, in my opinion, harsh and unethical ways, And so, do I really need a bunch of huckleberries? How important is that to me? And how important is it to leave wild forage for other species, other animals? What are the stresses on that plant, right? So that can be, again, that can be things like invasive species, that can be insect infestations, that can be climate issues, that can be drought, that can be fire, there can be, all flooding, that there can be all kinds of things that can stress out a plant or a population of plants. What are the other living things that rely on this plant? And I'm going to tell you a little story about arnica, Arnica cordifolia, which is a plant that grows in the mountains around here. And it is a beautiful yellow flower. And I have wildcrafted it for many years. It's my favorite species of arnica to use. Very low dose plant. You've got to be very careful with it. Mostly I use it topically. I'll make like a salve or a liniment or an oil and it's great for like sore muscles and achy joints and things like that. So topical use is safe. It's a very low dose though. So I don't recommend, unless you're an herbalist and you know what you're doing, I don't recommend using it internally. You can use the homeopathic remedy internally. But anyway, so I harvest arnica. I'm going to tell you two little stories. So the first is that one of the first years I was living in Missoula, I went to harvest arnica and I was up in the mountains and I found this beautiful patch of flowers and I thought, oh, this is going to be lovely. Like this will be perfect. And I hiked in, got out of my car, hiked into the woods and had all my stuff ready to go. And I got down into the patch and I realized there were cuts. Someone had already been there and had already harvested from that patch. And my first thought was like, oh, okay, I'm not going to harvest here because someone already has, and I don't want to impact anymore. Like that's enough. I'll find another patch. That was my first thought. And my second thought was like, I wish I could meet the person that harvested this patch because they did a beautiful job of leaving lots and lots and lots of flowers so that really, if you stepped back even a little ways, you couldn't even tell that this patch had been harvested. And that's the way I love to harvest. Like I said, I want to look back, I want to leave and look back and go, there's no, I can't even tell. someone could walk by, they wouldn't even know that I had harvested that spot, right? And so I thought like, well, I'd love to meet this person because they did such a beautiful job of just taking a little and doing it really respectfully. So that's the first story. The second story is about this little spider, and I need to find out the name. I don't know the name of the spider, but it's this little kind of off-white, almost yellowish kind of spider. And the only place I've ever seen it is on arnica flowers. So it lives on the arnica flowers. And so every time I harvest, and at first when I started, I was like, I just started noticing it as I was harvesting and being like, oh, look at this little spider. And then realizing like this spider, this is the only place I see it. And this is where it lives. It lives on the arnica. And when I realized that, I thought, oh, this is really special and important. It's like, I don't want to disturb this little being. And so whenever I would go to harvest arnica, and still to this day, I look for those spiders. And if there's a spider on one of those flowers, I don't touch it. And the reason for that is because that's that spider's home. That spider lives there. It has this relationship with this flower. There is no way I'm going to deprive it of its home, take that away. And so I don't know if it lays eggs and it doesn't even matter. That is that spider's home. So what I do is if I see an insect or like a spider web or whatever it is on the plant, I leave that be. So I'm also looking as I'm wildcrafting, I'm looking very carefully and I'm noticing as much as I possibly can about where I'm stepping, about each single plant that I'm working with, and if it's appropriate or not to be harvesting that specific individual plant as well as that species. Okay, so we're going to get back in here. And we've already done this slide. So more questions to ask. Are we on the edge of a plant's ecosystem? Now, this is really important, and it's especially really important with climate change. And the reason for that is the plants at the center of their ecosystem are the plants that have most everything that they need, the right climate, the right precipitation, the right soil conditions, the right everything, right? They're in the center of what's the best for them, for that species. Now, this is slowly changing as our climate is changing, right? But the plants that are on the edge of the ecosystem, so maybe they get colder temperatures or warmer temperatures or not quite enough precipitation or whatever it is, it's just they can just tolerate the conditions they're living in, right? Because that's the edge of their ecosystem, just what they can tolerate. Those are the plants that are most important for the survival of that species. And that's because they have the genetic ability to tolerate those types of conditions. And so those are the ones that I think are very important to leave them be because they're the ones that are going to be able to tolerate the climate changes that are happening. So how do we figure that out? We can look at the United States USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, has a map for every plant species and their habitat, their ecosystem. And you can find those online where you can look and see, oh, here's where they live, right? And here's the edge. This is the boundary. And those are always changing a little bit, but it gives us a good idea of like kind of where those edges are. If we live right in that edge, we might actually want to travel more towards the center of their ecosystem to harvest that species. Do you have the time to process the plant? So every once in a while, I'll be traveling somewhere and I'll run into like an amazing stand of some plant that I would love to harvest. And my first thought is, do I have the time? Right? Am I going to be able to actually process this plant? So in the next, say, 24 hours or so, and maybe with roots and barks, we can wait a little longer depending on the plant. But we want to make sure that we actually have the time to make use of that plant. So we don't want it to just die and grow mold or whatever and not use it. But I also think about, do I have the tools to harvest? And so if I don't have snips or if I don't have a shovel or whatever in my car, I will not harvest that plant. I have had occasionally students who have taken this class and then we're out in the wild, like, on a field trip with them, and they're ripping or pulling or and one of the things I talk about is like, treat a plant like you want to be treated. Would you want to be ripped or pulled or snip? Like it's much better for the plant to snip it, to cut it, right? It's cleaner, that wound heals better. It's just much easier on the plant, less chance of infection and those types of things. And I think it probably feels better for the plant as well. So the idea of like ripping and pulling a plant to harvest it, that's not okay, in my opinion. And so if we don't have the proper tools that we need to be able to harvest, we should not be harvesting that plant. You can come back later, make a note, come back next year, whatever it is. But as my friend Seven Song would say, herbs first, right? In other words, consider the plant first before you consider your own desires. Yeah. Um, that's fair, I feel like, and that's respectful. All right. Here, this is in my garage. This is a drying rack that I have set up. And this is just an example of these are obviously rose petals. So I harvest them as they bloom. And so we have some dried rose petals on the right, a few calendula flowers down below there, and some fresh rose petals on the left. And what I do is as they dry, I scoot them to the edge. So I kind of pile them up once they're dried and add new ones on the side if I'm harvesting over time and let those dry. So by the end of the season, I have a beautiful pile of rose petals or calendula flowers that are really nicely dried in the shade. And I'm ready to put those in a glass jar with a tight fitting lid and label them and use them when I'm ready. So tuning in, there is something really special about gathering your own plants, right? It gives us the opportunity to develop a personal relationship and a personal history with our medicine. Personally, my feeling is if I go out and I want to wildcraft something and it ends up happening that I don't wildcraft something, I still feel like that is really time well spent. That simply just being out in nature with plants and animals and insects and all those beautiful living things is healing. And that all of us as humans, um, what some of what our hearts really need and desire is that connection with other species on the planet and with our animal connection with others, right, in the web of life. That is healing in and of itself. So if you end up going out into wildcraft and you in the end you don't get any plants, I would still consider that a very successful experience. You might have the opportunity to sit like these students are sitting with, and this is balsam root, sit with that plant and get to know it better. Notice who lives near it. Notice who's interacting with it. Meditate with it, develop a connection with it, right? So there's all kinds of ways that we can interact with herbs or other plants or nature in general that can be very, very beneficial to us. So we can learn where they like to grow, who they like to grow near, who they're sharing their environment with. This is a quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer, like I said, one of my absolute very favorite authors and books. This is from Braiding Sweetgrass. Knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond. So beautiful. All right. So to begin, sit quietly and tune in. So when I go out to a wild place and I'm thinking about wildcrafting, I will walk into the forest or meadow or wherever I'm going and sit down and stop. Stop, if I was driving or hiking or whatever, I'm going to sit and I'm going to be quiet. I will close my eyes. You don't have to, but I find it helpful and just sink down into the ground, into that space, into that environment, and sit quietly. I really think that however we choose to do this, and this can be different for different people, it's not the same for everyone, but to meditate with a plant or to connect with a plant quietly and spiritually or visually, or however it is that feels authentic to you, can be a really deeply enriching and rewarding and even healing experience. One of the things that I think we need to be open to is being told no. So if we're going to, so I will go and sit with a plant, I'll tune in, I'll check in, I'll sink down and calm down, right? Maybe meditate or focus on my breath, be mindful, breathe deeply, arrive in the moment, and then ask. And maybe even have a conversation. Sometimes I'll tell the plant, like, this is why I would like to gather you. This is what you offer to humans. And I really deeply appreciate that. And I'm wondering if it's okay with you if I gather some of you. And I'm usually talking to a single plant, but what I'm doing is I'm asking for permission for that species in that area. So that plant, in a way, is like a representative of the species to be able to say, can I harvest your kind here? Can I harvest your kin here? Right? And then I wait. I wait for an answer. And that can feel really hard, especially if you haven't done this before. Like, how do you know if the plant is saying yes or no? Like, it's very could be very challenging to tell. And what I would say is sometimes it's a feeling, like it feels good. It just feels like very happy and positive. Or sometimes it's a feeling like, that just doesn't feel quite right. Um, Maybe it feels kind of sad or bad or like a pushing back, right? Sometimes it's a visual, like the plant actually it seems like literally happy to be participating and to be like, yes, 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 you can harvest me. I would love that. I'd love to help you out, right? So, and that is such a feeling of just like, what a gift. How generous, how immensely generous plants can be for us. So, but if the answer is no, then that's good. That's a good no. And we need to be open to being told no, even if we really, really want that plant. If the answer is no and you harvest it anyway, it doesn't make good medicine. It's not going to be healing and good for you or for anyone else. So it's really important to listen, and we can tune in and continue to tune into that, right? So sometimes it's visual for me, like a little bit of a shimmer or like sometimes the plant will even like move a little bit, and maybe it's the wind, but I'm watching and I'm just like looking for a sign, if you will, right? Um, and and so I'll tell you about one other experience I've had with this, which is with pulsatilla, also called windflower, a very, very strong medicine and one of my very favorite herbs in the whole world. And it grows in the Rocky Mountains. And this is an herb that grows in the early spring. It almost looks like a little fuzzy tulip, is what it looks like. And It is so mighty. It's a very strong medicine, but it's this little fragile, sweet little plant. And one of my friends said once, he's a botanist, and he was like, it looks like it should be pollinated by fairies. He said, I swear fairies are the pollinators of this plant. And I thought that was so lovely and probably true. But so this plant in the very early spring, like when it's still freezing at night and there can be snow on the ground, this plant will grow and bloom very early spring. And it's so mighty because it can survive those freezing nights. It can survive like coming up through the snow. And it's just like so fragile and so strong. And it just like takes my breath away. So beautiful. But I will go out looking for this plant in the spring some years if we need it. You don't need much because it's really strong. But we'll go looking for it. And usually John will be driving and I'll be looking out the window looking for the pulsatilla. And eventually maybe I see one. I'm like, oh, stop the car. We have to get out and look and we'll go walking out into the field. It likes like open forest pretty much. And we'll go out looking and there's one. And all of a sudden, there's another. And all of a sudden, there's another. And oh my God, they're all over the place, right? And I didn't even see them before. Like I only saw one. So that right there is a good sign that like I feel like pulsatilla like will hide, literally. Like it doesn't just show itself. It's like, who are you and what are your intentions? I'm going to check you out first and we'll see. And so if I start, so I always, that's always how it works for me. Like I'll just see one and then there's more and there's more and there's more. And that's a good sign like, oh, it's showing itself to me. Like, okay, that's a sign of possibly a yes, right? So then I'll sit down with pulsatilla and ask. And if I feel that it's a yes, I'll harvest some very, very carefully because usually, again, it's one flower per plant, right? So I might harvest just a little one leaf of the plant, or I might harvest a flower, or I might harvest and then walk a ways and get another one. And so I'm having just a small amount of little bits from different plants. That's how I generally like to harvest, right? So, and then if we're on our way back, all of a sudden we're driving down and they're everywhere. There was literally a mile of that plant down the road, everywhere. And now I'm seeing it everywhere. Now that it checked me out and was like, okay, you're all right. You can do this. So anyway, that's an example of what a yes feels like for me, with that herb in particular, which is very special and something that I've developed over years of getting to know that plant. Okay, so now we're going to take a quick break. I encourage you to take a break, get up, move around, go eat or drink or take care of yourself, and we'll come back soon. Thank you. All right. So a couple other things about wildcrafting that I wanted to mention. It can be honestly really hard to take a life of a plant. I have noticed that for me, it feels different with vegetables. Like when I grow vegetables, if I pull up a carrot or something, it doesn't quite feel the same. Or even when I harvest a plant, like a medicinal plant from my own garden, it feels a little different than harvesting a wild plant. I remember the first time I dug up when I was in herb school, I dug up a root of yucca. And I was shocked at how sad I felt doing that and just how it felt profound. Like, this is a big deal. This is not something to take lightly. And I hadn't expected that feeling really because I'd grown plants and harvested vegetables and all of those things. So I was actually kind of surprised at how intense it felt to do that. I also want to suggest that you bring an offering with you. And I have another little story to tell you, which I heard secondhand. So I don't know all the details, but I think it's worth telling, is that there was a ethnobotanist in Africa, and he was studying this plant that grows in the desert, and that some tribes, and again, I don't know where, But in desert people, people who would travel through the desert would use this root. They would dig it up and they would use it for water, right, to drink or get fluid to be able to traverse the desert in part of Africa. And what the ethnobotanist was noticing is that there were way more of these plants growing along this route that this tribe would take than there were in other parts of the desert. And he thought, well, that's really strange because actually they're using more of that plant. I would think there would be less of it in these areas that they're traveling. And so he went to the tribe and he said, why would this be that there's more of this plant in these areas that you travel? And they said, oh, that's easy. We sing to our plant. It's our beloved plant. We have this song that's just for that plant and we sing to it. And I thought that was just really beautiful in that they have an offering of a song and they have, that travels through the generations with them to sing to this plant, this plant that they love and that actually helps them survive in this really harsh climate. And that's their offering, right? And how much they value and love that plant. So we can do other offerings, right? And indigenous people in North America, some of their offerings have been things like tobacco or cornmeal. I'm not suggesting that we use those same things. If that's not necessarily your tradition, right? Some of the things that I like to do is I like to give water if I feel like the plants might need extra water because they're having a hard time. I'll bring some water to offer them. Another thing that I really like to do is pull invasive weeds if I feel like they're encroaching on a native plants that are having some trouble. And I also love to pick up trash. So if I go to an area and there's trash around, I will always clean it up. So you could make a song, right? The other thing I love to do, and this is just something I don't know if it's an offering, but it's something that I really enjoy, is just like touching the plant in a really soft, loving, gentle way. And I just love doing that. It's a way that I feel like that I connect with plants is just this soft, loving touch that I can give them. And it's a beautiful way to connect. So lots of ways. Prayers, right, could be another way to do that. And then the last thing I want to mention in this section is working on our feelings of personal scarcity. And so, and this I find especially happens if we're in a group. So I remember being in herb school, my first herb school, both my herb schools that I went to were like this, but our teacher we'd be out on a field trip out in the wilds, and our teacher would tell us about an amazing plant. And everyone would be like, wow, I would love to have some of that, right? And this was in the 1990s where there wasn't as much, they were developing their environmental ethics around wildcrafting and things like that. And I feel like they're always developing, right? Still, they are. But so kind of like one thing my first teacher told me is take 1 in 10, right? Which the problem with that is that what does that leave in the end? It leaves 9. If everyone goes and takes 1 in 10, we've got 9. And that's not enough of pretty much any plant. So, but it was a start, right? But this idea that everyone would kind of, and there was no talking about it first when I was in herb school. There wasn't any, and this is why this class that I teach right here, I teach to every single herb class that I have because it's so important. Ethical wildcrafting is the core. It should be the core of any class where you're going to show students plants in the wild. We need to know how to interact with them and harvest them in a way that's ethical. And so that wasn't really happening back when I went to herb school very much, right? And everybody would run, all the students would run out to try to get a plant, as much as they could of that plant. And everybody else was trying to get it too. And that felt like that feeling of like, am I going to get it? Am I going to get enough? Will there be enough for me? Right. And now I feel like we need to just be really thoughtful about, yeah, like I'll notice if I have that feeling like, oh, there's that feeling of like, am I going to have enough? Right. What about me? Or I really want that one, and um now I can just notice that and go, oh yeah, there's that feeling again, right? Of just like that scarcity feeling of, will I get enough or can I have any or whatever it is? And there are things that are more important than that feeling, right? So it's just good to notice it and be like, oh, yep, there that is. It doesn't mean I have to gather it. As a matter of fact, that feeling is not going to guide me. I can notice it and I can be like, all right, I hear that you feel that way. And this is more important. The plant is more important. The life of these plants and this species is much more important than that. And this ecosystem, right? And so that's what matters the most. And that's what matters the most to me. And I hope that's what matters the most to every wildcrafter, everyone who's going out into the wilds to forage or wildcraft medicinal plants or foods.